So it's the middle of the Cold War. You're an East German flying back home from Poland, but when the plane lands and you look out of the window, you realize that you are in fact in West Berlin, on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. Not only that, but you are surrounded by armed American soldiers. Well, now what? Well, this is exactly what happened to the passengers on board flight LO165 on the 30th of August 1978. Now, in fact, the plane had been hijacked, although most of the passengers hadn't realized anything was wrong until the plane had landed. But the story doesn't begin with the hijacker. It begins with a West German man called Horst Fischer. Now, he was a site manager working for a West German construction company that had been commissioned to build a meat processing factory in East Germany. While he was there, he met Ingrid Ruske, a former waitress, and they fell in love. But after 2 years, the project that he was working on was nearing completion and he would have to return home, and so they decided that Ingrid would somehow leave East Berlin to go and live with him in Hamburg. And to help them, they brought along an old friend of Ingrid's, Detlef Tiede, who had been trying for years to leave East Germany legally. And also, Ingrid had a young daughter who would also be coming with them. The plan was for Horst to get a fake West Berlin ID card for Ingrid. They would travel separately to the Polish city of Gdansk and from there take a ferry to the West German city of Lübeck. However, Horst didn't make it to the rendezvous. Ingrid and Detlef came to the conclusion, correctly as it turned out, that their plan had been discovered and Horst had been arrested, and so they changed their plans. They went to a flea market, bought a toy gun, and then went to the airport and booked a flight back to Berlin. There was a very tense moment when a security guard found the gun, but she immediately recognized it as a toy and assumed that it must belong to Ingrid's daughter. As the plane approached Berlin, Detlef rose from his seat, having had a few stiff drinks to steady his nerves, and went into the galley. There he grabbed a stewardess from behind by the hair and forced her to the floor. He then put the muzzle of the toy gun against the back of her head and demanded that the plane land at Tempelhof Airport in West Berlin. It looked very convincing. Few of the passengers could see what was happening, and the gun was partially covered by the hostage's hair, so it looked real enough. However, Tempelhof Airport at the time was in use by the US military, and so things were about to get a bit complicated. The landing itself was a little tricky because the runway was slightly too short for that particular type of plane, but the pilots did just manage to get it down safely, and then, well, it was surrounded by American soldiers. This was, after all, a hijacking. Nobody knew what was going to happen next. Now, of course, they very quickly realized that the gun was fake and that the hijackers' only motive was to escape East Germany. Of the 62 other passengers, or 50, depending on which source you choose to believe, 6 also elected to stay in West Berlin, although one of them did later return. The other passengers were taken by bus to East Berlin, but not by a direct route. They were treated to a long sightseeing tour of West Berlin by a guide who was apparently trying to convince them that it would be better for them to stay in the West, and who couldn't imagine why they wouldn't want to. These people, you understand, had just been through a hijacking and they just wanted to get back home to their families. But their ordeal was not yet over. As soon as they arrived back in East Berlin, they were taken in for questioning by the East German authorities and held for 2 hours before finally being allowed home. The question now was what to do with the hijackers. Now, on the one hand, their motives were completely understandable and they hadn't intended to do anybody any harm, but on the other, they had hijacked a plane and taken an innocent person hostage. In those days, hijackings were terrifyingly common and nobody wanted to encourage any more of them. They had to be put on trial, but the next question was, whose responsibility were they? The Polish authorities had demanded their extradition, but the US military refused. The West German authorities didn't really want to have to deal with this situation, but neither did the Americans particularly. Eventually, though, it did fall to the Americans. Now, as part of the agreement under which they occupied their part of West Germany and their part of West Berlin, they had the right to set up their own courts. Now, this clause had never actually been invoked before, but it was invoked now, which turned out to be a bit problematic. The court had to apply German law, but the trial itself was conducted in the style of a US-American trial. And among other things, that meant trial by jury, which is very common in some jurisdictions like the United Kingdom or the United States, but completely unknown in modern Germany. They had to find 12 West Berliners to serve as jurors, but who had absolutely no idea what was going on or what they were supposed to do. The judge was American, but had to make decisions based on German law. It was not an easy trial. The charges against Ingrid were dropped as the judge found that she had not been properly informed of her rights and had not been given proper access to a lawyer. Detlef, the one who had actually done the hijacking, was found guilty of hostage-taking and was sentenced to 9 months in prison, which he had already served in custody and so was allowed to go free. Ingrid's boyfriend Horst, however, had been arrested trying to cross into Poland and sentenced to 8 years in prison. When he was finally freed and allowed to return to West Germany, he met up with Ingrid and the couple got married. I wish I could tell you it was a fairy tale ending, but sadly they divorced after 11 years. Ingrid was never particularly happy with her new life and later commented that she'd had no great expectations of the West, but even the ones that she'd had were not met. And the East German State Security Service, the Stasi, had to answer a very embarrassing question. How could an airliner have been hijacked by a man that they had at the time under close surveillance? Inside of the Iron Curtain and surrounded by and put a forced her to although came to the conclusion leave East things was